The SJC has ruled the MBTA compliance guidelines are unenforceable.
Governor Healy is going to pull out her magic Jedi mind trick and say, these are the guidelines you're looking for. I'm Brian Costello.
And I'm Greg Richards, and we are the Unselects. Hey, Brian, the last episode, you had submitted the referendum petition signatures for verification. And I think we want to give people an update on where we're at in the process. As we mentioned in the intro there, the SJC ruling actually has come back, which was, I think, a little surprising to me. It came back so early, but it does give us some clarity on what's going to happen next, and I think what that means overall for this referendum and for Shrewsbury. So I think that's what we're going to get into today. So you did submit the signatures. They were certified, and we do have an election scheduled for February 4th.
That's correct.
That's correct. So let's go back and let's listen to John Samia talk about the certification of those signatures from a select board meeting.
A referendum petition under Section 16 of Chapter 553 of the Acts of 1953 was received. A petition for a townwide ballot question would be considered valid if it's signed by not less than 5% of the registered voters of the town, which amounts to 1,349 signatures, and based on the certification process from the town clerk that it was certified as of December 5th, 2024, with 1,700 signatures certified.
So 1,700 signatures out of the 1,800. I wonder what happened to the other 100. I don't know.
No, nobody knows. We'll never find out.
We never find out. We never asked. But hey, 1,700 is a great number. I mean, that's a lot of people. Obviously, there's a lot of people in town who were interested in this enough to actually come and sign it. So a huge victory there. That's the second time ever that has been used since 1953, actually. So 1995 was the last time. We're going to talk about 1995 again today with some more details as well. The next thing I want to go to here is there were some comments in the select board meeting regarding what would happen to Shrewsbury as far as from a compliance standpoint and what the SJC ruling will really mean. And I have two clips here. I have John Samia as well as the Attorney General, Andrea Campbell, together here. And let's just talk about this after we see what they have to say.
The SJC will provide clarity about the enforcement mechanism, but what's still at hand for us is that we will not be in compliance and we will not be able to avail ourselves of the many categories of grants that have been discussed.
If you end up losing the case with Milton at the SJC...
I'm not putting that in.
I know you're not, but assuming that you do, for argument's sake...
I'm not.
Would a town that voted under the law that was nullified by the court still... Would their vote still be in effect, or because it was under the... You don't want to answer the question?
Well, no, we have no idea.
Okay.
Because we have no idea what
Okay.
the court's going to come back with, and
Okay.
especially in terms of the remedy.
Now, this is a little bit complicated, so I want to get your take on this because it depends on who you ask based off that ruling. Was it a win? Who was it a win for? I mean, the governor, the AG, of course, they're celebrating this as some massive victory. However, when you really look at it, that unenforceability of guidelines, which is really what they found. I'm looking at the decision here, 23 pages. So the court was very clear that said the guidelines are unenforceable. Why don't we walk back? Can you help people understand why are the guidelines so important? And to Mr. Samia's, I guess, point, what is the compliance status of Shrewsbury now after this ruling?
Yeah, it's actually not that complex. The MBTA law, right, was a fairly small law. And in it, it said that the EOHLC had to provide guidelines. What ended up happening was they didn't follow the rules, and they got slapped down by the SJC. In those guidelines is everything that we've been talking about. So Mr. Samia was a little bit incorrect and maybe should have done his homework a little bit more along with the select board, because our point of view was if those guidelines get shot down in the SJC, we have no compliance issue, which we no longer do. So right now, Shrewsbury is perfectly fine because there is no compliance guideline, right? As a matter of fact, at this point in time, this day, Shrewsbury isn't even an MBTA community because the definition of MBTA community for adjacent communities is in the guideline, right?
Well, yeah, I think technically we are still and MBTA community from the statute standpoint, and will show what we actually pay per year
Yeah.
to have the designation. But to your point, being an adjacent community, all those, what does that mean? That was in the guidelines,
Yeah.
to your point. What I want to do here, and we're going to obviously go into this in much more detail, but let's take a look at what the news actually said about this yesterday, because this just happened yesterday, on what the court case really ultimately means.
The ruling is in from the Supreme Judicial Court, which says the state's MBTA Communities Act is legal, but says the current guidelines are unenforceable. Now, this is the law that requires cities and towns that have T-service to build more multifamily housing. When Milton voters rejected the required zoning changes, the state sued the town and withheld grant funding. Well, the SJC said that the law is legal, the Attorney General can enforce it, but the court also said the state did not follow the proper rules when it wrote the guidelines. And the governor says emergency regulations may be refiled by the end of this week to comply with the court's decision.
Okay, I just want to see if I can understand that. So guidelines unenforceable have to get redone. The guidelines contained a majority of the teeth, meaning how many units we needed to have, what percentage of housing units would calculate that, a lot of details around how we built the zone here in town. So yes, we do have to create a zone. We're not saying that we don't. We have to. That was clear in the case. But what does it look like? You know, we have no idea because there's no guidelines, right? It's gone.
It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore, right? So what is the definition of a multifamily unit? How many people can be in a multifamily unit? The size of the zone, the types of buildings, where the zones can, no, it just disappeared.
Right.
Right.
And the other part, which I think is interesting as well, is they say, oh, we're going to file emergency regulations, which to me, this is the biggest issue. This is a bone of contention, I think, that we as residents in this state need to shut this down. They use this term emergency for whatever they want, because my understanding, if you go back and listen, you'll see in a future episode here when we talk about how the governor talks about the MBTA Communities Act, but they're very clear about this is not a housing mandate. This is a zoning mandate. So explain to me how zoning, which requires no building, is this utmost emergency that says, you know what? If we don't zone, people are going to die.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and you know the funny thing is they use the word emergency, and in the statute 30A, which the SJC said, hey, you have to follow these rules, right, in order to promulgate regulations. There is a section in there about emergencies, and it says you can declare an emergency. It's very specific, but it's only good for 3 months, and then you have to go through this entire process. I think what's going to happen is if she declares an emergency, there will be an immediate court challenge. That challenge, by the way, under 30A goes directly to the SJC. So one judge will hear it and then it will go to the panel, right? So this SJC was very clear in this that you must follow these guidelines to pass regulations.
Right, and there's this very specific process that APA, right? The Administrative Procedures Act is very clear about the timing, who has to be involved. And you also have to do these fiscal impact studies, not only for the communities, but also a small business impact study. And all those things take time, consultants, and you're talking about 177 communities. So this is not something, it's not feasible to do in 2 days. And if they somehow, you know, just like you said, Jedi mind trick this thing and say, now where everybody's fine. No, don't worry about what the court actually said. I mean, that, to me, is a clear violation of separation of powers.
Absolutely. And the reality is this doesn't even take 3 months. This takes months. If you look at how regulations, as a matter of fact, I think we were talking earlier, the guidelines, the public comment time for the accessory dwelling units is ending today. This was a months-long process, and it doesn't automatically mean it's a regulation. Now the next step happens.
Right.
This is a process.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do this process. That's a bureaucrat or a politician, but this is what the reality is.
Exactly. So let's just take a look at the verbiage here, one quick slide, just so you can actually see what it actually said. It says what we've talked about this before. It clearly states that because the housing and livable communities guidelines were not promulgated in accordance with the APA, we declare them ineffective, as such, unenforceable. Very clear decision by the court
Yeah.
there. And, we look at what does that really mean at the bottom, for a community like Shrewsbury? Well, this gives us an opportunity to work with the state and actually put some thoughtful zoning together here and not just say, okay, well, where we put the zone, well, maybe you don't need a zone for 1,500 units. Maybe it doesn't need to be as big. There's a whole bunch of things that would go into what we want to change. And, that gives people time to participate in creating these, like give public input, like you said.
Especially towns.
Right.
I challenge everybody in our town that's an elected official or an appointed official that has something to do with this to start working with other towns. This is an opportunity to change, for instance, even the definition of an adjacent community. It can change a lot if this goes through the correct process, where actually now so many people have woken up to this issue. These guidelines are not going to be the guidelines that they were yesterday.
Well, yes, unless they mind trick them in.
They'll try to mind trick them in, but I even think then you are going to have legal challenges there. And we'll see what happens. It is Massachusetts. We don't know.
We don't know.
Right.
So it's still to be determined.
Yeah.
So what I want to do now is I do want to go back to a topic that it's kind of been a lot of contentious dialogue, I think, on the Facebook communities in town, and a lot of people have talked about it. It's how did we select as a community the February 4th date as an election, and some nuances to the referendum process. I think it's really important we go through this, so we're going to go back through this in detail. So we're going to transition here, and we're going to go back to a clip here of Kevin Mizikar talking about outlining 4 options that he provided the select board with the date for the election once those votes were certified, or I should say the petition was certified. Let's take a listen.
So, board members, I've developed 4 scenarios for your consideration this evening. I've labeled them A, B, C, and D. Primary driver behind scenario A is the 35-day requirement, what is proposed here under scenario A of a date of January 28th, 2025. So scenario B is quite similar to scenario A, but it is a week later. It has the special election called on February 4th, 2025. Under scenario C, we're proposing a date of March 4th, 2025, so a month later. And then finally, holding the election on the town's normal election day, which is May 6th, 2025 this year. So the ballot question would be co-located on the local official ballot for anyone running for office.
So that was the 4 options that were provided, and they were essentially the earliest it could be by statute. I think the latest by statute was co-locating on the ballot, and then 2 in the middle on 2 Tuesdays. And we're not going to go into detail now. We're going to listen to the dialogue around what decision was ultimately made and some of the nuances. But one other point I do want to bring up is related to cost, because this had come up before. I think we had talked about it in the last episode that people were, opining on Facebook about, well, hey, we're going to spend $20,000 or $30,000 on this. Is this really something that's necessary? But Kevin Mizikar did bring up that one of these options would mitigate that cost. So let's take a listen.
There will be a cost to this, so co-locating it on a special town election ballot would save any extraordinary costs associated with running a special election.
Okay, so one of 4 options would mitigate the cost. So that would be one of the actually, I think a couple benefits of the May election, but one of them being cost.
Right.
Right, fair. So let's move forward here and kind of talk about, and we're going to go to town council. Now, town council was in the select board meeting on the 17th. And he actually was there to talk a lot about this statute because it hasn't been used that much. Like I said, it hasn't been used in 30 years since 95. So there was a lot of questions about how a referendum in Shrewsbury actually works. So let's take a listen to a couple comments that he had to make here.
The quantum of vote that's required under Section 16 is rather unique. Most ballot elections, you would expect a simple majority would win the day, but the provision in Section 16, which is state law, provides that no action of the representative town meeting may be overturned unless at least 20% of the registered voters vote in favor of reversing such action. So not only must the no votes be in the majority, they must be at least 20% of the registered voters in the town.
So that is a state statute for any town with representative town meeting. But just to be clear, so that the voters in Shrewsbury understand, is not only do the no vote does a no vote have to win, but at least 20% of all registered voters have to vote no, which means you need a lot more than 20% probably to show up.
Right.
What is your thoughts about that and how that was set up?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously set up by people that don't want things changed, right? There's a pretty good argument to be made that state bureaucrats working with local officials really don't like it when the citizens decide to change what was voted on, right? And so this is an example of that, where they make the hurdle quite large. I think it's still worth doing, obviously, but it is a big hurdle that was built by people that don't like citizens actually raising their hand and making an argument.
Right. And part of me almost says, well, in parallel, you should say then maybe we should make the quantum of vote for how many of our town meeting members have to show up a little bit higher, because as we've shown in a lot of other episodes, a lot of people don't show up.
Right.
So if you're going to put the onus on the residents to have to show up at the polls, then maybe we should say, well, guess what? If we don't, maybe our quorum of town meeting members needs to actually be established to be higher. And if those people aren't going to attend, guess how quickly we'll change who's voted as town meeting members if we can't actually hold a town meeting because not enough are showing up.
Take it a step further, make sure that in our town, like in other towns, we actually know how your town meeting member voted.
Right. And we will talk about that a lot a little bit later on here. Because the quantum of vote part, just to note, in 1995, when the other referendum was done, the no vote won. However, there were 105 votes short of the 20%, so therefore it was not overturned. So there you have, majority of the community who voting in a direction who was, to say, disenfranchised because, oh, guess what? You didn't hit your 20% rule. I mean, that is the rule. So I'm not, but to your point, that's a rule that potentially should be changed. And that's not a Shrewsbury rule. That is a state rule. But it probably was created by those state people who said, you know what? Let's make it hard for people to disagree with us.
Exactly.
All right. The next piece we want to talk about, which I think I want to talk about a lot more, is the hours of polling. So let's listen to our town council talk about what the special act says.
One last quirk, if you will, or interesting aspect of Section 16, it sets the hours for the election of 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., which is different than in the general laws. The general laws prescribe hours for, minimum hours for a polling place to be open for election of town officers. And I wasn't certain if that would be applicable, if it would override, the general laws would override our special act, but I confirmed with the elections division of the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office that the special act governs the referendum election. So the hours of the polls will be 2 p.m. to 8 p.m.
Okay. We're going to take a little legal deep dive into this because I think you and I have talked about this offline, obviously, of the show, but I really dug into this deep. We've had a lot of conversations about it, and I need your legal mind to analyze this. And I'm going to show some people things. I took it on myself to, number one, I did contact the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, which is the Secretary of State here in Massachusetts, and asked the same questions because I was curious. And I also FOIA'd the emails communication between town council because I wanted to actually see what was asked, how it was asked, because it's very important. I think one thing to keep in mind in legal realms, the way you ask questions, how lawyers communicate, often impact the outcome. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's true.
And we're going to show people how that actually occurred in this instance, at least how I believe it occurred, right? We're making statements here of what our beliefs are, right? And I think we're making a case that you can choose to agree or disagree with us, but I believe this is how this actually
It's an
went down.
opinion-based analysis.
Absolutely. So let's take a look. So with the communications, the email from our town council, right, there was a phone call, as often it happens. They had a dialogue, and now he's documenting this phone call. And as you know, the way that you essentially get people to agree with you is you kind of lead them down a path. And that's what essentially has happened here. And I think what happens in legal realms is if you give a lawyer the opportunity or two lawyers talking, they tend to want to agree with each other and not argue, especially if they're on the same team. If you're on a different team opposing council, different story.
Correct.
But would you agree that our town council and the Secretary of Commonwealth are on the same team?
Absolutely.
Okay, fair enough. So he's stating that there was a special town meeting on the 18th, and the question came up concerning, the hours of polling, and he just wanted to walk through this and saying, hey, there's two things that govern this. There's section 16 of our referendum in the special act, which says the polls shall, be opened at 2:00 in the afternoon, and they should be closed no earlier than 8:00 in the evening. The other part of that, no earlier, this is why I think it's interesting to me, because you have conflicting laws often. You have something on a local level and a state level. There is a state statute that says you cannot have a poll opened later than 8:00.
Right.
So therefore, in this case, we have one option according to this, 2 to 8. Fair? So he writes, though, that in red here, this is the key part. I did not find any position in the general laws, or I should say part of the general laws, to override the special act and require the polls to be open longer than the specified act. Now, required is an interesting word. What would be a more, let's say softer word than require? Like if you were, let's say the positive side of it. Maybe like allow. How about that, right?
Yeah, that works.
So in my mind, if the town is like, I think the best option here is to give the voters as much time at the polls as possible, how can I make that happen? I might write this and say, I didn't find anything that would allow them to be longer. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I did find something, and I'll show you what I think he could have found that allows them to be open longer.
Yeah, I think it's how it's positioned, right? So the positioning could have been, I am pro-voter, and hey, we have these bylaws, but in today's world, can we figure out how to keep the polls open longer? Like, what's our option there? Do you have any suggestions? To your point, the attorney should have then said, here's what I found.
Right.
But I'd love your opinion.
And he did. If you go to the next piece here, right? And he goes, okay, well, let's go to Mass General Law, Chapter 54, Section 64.
Yeah.
And in that, it actually says the selectmen in any town may provide the hours during which the polls shall be opened for the purpose of voting on a question, which is what this was, is a question to the voters at large, and they could have those hours be the same as they are opened for any normal election, right? So that was one there. But he says, right, this is where I point at, I think there was an intent of our town council to get a certain outcome. It says, in my view, the provision, right, controls the hours of referendum, and the select board has no authority under Mass General Law to set any different hours. Please let me know if the office disagrees. So essentially leading the horse to water, saying, I couldn't find anything here. I don't think the select board has any authority at all.
Yeah.
Would you disagree with me? And of course, the state says, I agree with your position. Cut, paste.
Yeah.
Right? That's essentially what it is. I agree with your position, and they have, you have no ability to change it. I hope this was insightful and helpful.
Yeah, I think there's also, from the state's perspective, they will defer to the opinion of the town council when they might not know the answer or want to do any more work, right? So while the town council clearly wants this to be 2 to 8, I'm not going to disagree with him because it's fuzzy. There might be some fuzziness here, and so this is what they want. I'm good with it.
Well, I think the assumption is that the town council should know the acts of the town it represents better than the state,
Right.
because does the state can know 351 different acts? However, our town council is not a full-time town council for Shrewsbury. He works at an independent law firm. He's not an employee of the town of Shrewsbury, right? And to your point, I did call the Secretary of Commonwealth, and they said, yes, we typically don't like to opine on local issues. We do fall back to town council. Right. So it's my belief that if town council would have worded the email differently and said, I believe we can use Mass General Law 5464 and have the select board set these hours outside of the special act. This was from 1953. A lot has changed since then.
Yep.
I think this is perfectly fine for us to do that. And I think we might have got a different answer.
We would have. And I think also, if you look at 5464 or even the Voters' Bill of Rights, both of those have been updated since 1953. So the way I would have written that email is, these regulations that are in the state today came after the 1953 bylaw we have. I believe these regulations support more voter access.
Yep.
And I believe that a select board should be able to extend hours. Is this a correct view of this? And they probably would have cut and pasted. Yeah, sure, if that's what you believe.
I agree with you 100% on this one, because like you said, less work, the better in these things.
Right.
Yep, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I just want to listen to what John Sammy actually said, because he reported out essentially what occurred, and this is his version of that. And we'll see if we agree with his version of events.
Note that the polling hours are 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. as confirmed by Town Council and the Director of Elections Division at the Secretary of Commonwealth's office. The act establishing representative town meeting states that the poll shall be opened at 2 o'clock and shall be closed not earlier than 8 o'clock in the evening, and there is no discretion to move from that.
There's no discretion because our town council asked that there be no discretion.
That's basically, yeah. Hey, is it okay if I say that there's no discretion? Sure, go
Yeah,
for it.
absolutely. I agree with you. No discretion whatsoever. And the interesting thing I want to bring back, because I'm going to go back to 1995 again, because this came up in 1995. An article, I went to the archives of the Telegram and Gazette, and I found an article here. And it's interesting that a lot of people you're going to recognize the names of were involved. And there was one select board member who actually questioned this by the name of Karen Polito. So the former lieutenant governor was a select board member in Shrewsbury at the time. And she actually questioned whether the polling hours could be changed. The town manager at the time, Carney, who we've named the town hall after now, the Richard Carney Municipal Center, I believe, he said, well, that would require, town meeting to actually ask the selectmen to ask the legislature to change our special act. So this was a contentious point then. Nobody decided. The select board made no effort to correct it 30 years ago and has not done it again. And now it's now a contentious point again. So this needs to be changed. It's a very simple deletion. So either A, the select board is going to take this up in the next special town meeting or a town meeting, or I'm going to do this as a citizen's petition again, because this is a very reasonable thing to change. Say, look, we need to update this. This limited poll hours, 6 hours from 2 to 8 is silly. Yeah. Let's just make it normal. I think everybody would agree with that. So that is another thing we need to correct here in town. Fair?
Fair enough. Also, people don't forget, 1953, there weren't very many commuters. You were commuting to Worcester, right? Maybe. Right, most people worked around the town.
That's true.
Right, so it was easy to kind of stop by and make a vote pretty quickly. If you look at today's world, a lot of commuters going a long distance, a lot of people working from home. It's very different, right?
Yeah, what was the population of Shrewsbury in 1953? It's a lot less.
Yeah, like
right.
7,000 or something like that. I don't even know.
I don't either. We're probably wrong, but that's okay. All right, now we want to move forward here and actually see what the recommendation was from Kevin Mizikar, because he had those 4 dates. We're going back to the 4 dates.
Right.
And here's what he actually recommended to the select board.
My recommendation to the board would be the February 4th, 2025 date. I think it strikes a balance of expediency in resolving the matter, attempting to gain compliance, which has been a goal of the towns since this initiative came forward, with the adoption of the Economic Development Bill at the beginning of November. Additional grants have been identified and codified into law that are impacted by non-compliance. That list of grants we are still thoroughly vetting. Again, my recommendation would be February 4th, 2025.
Of course, almost the soonest it possibly could. And I don't fault him for this. I've always said this. Like, I don't agree with Kevin, but I understand why he's making these suggestions. He's representing, I would say, the corporation of Shrewsbury. It's mitigating risk. What's the least risky? Well, the least risky is let's get it done as quick as possible. They know, based off of the interaction with the town council and the state, we can limit how long polls are open.
Right.
The odds of getting 20% people to show up and vote and the opposite way in February when it's cold is probably low, this is our highest chance to get what we want. Or am I too cynical on that?
No, I would take it a step further. If you listen to all of his reasons, it's well, the compliance, not anymore. Grants, nope. It's no, 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 and no. Everything he stated is actually not correct anymore. And if they had listened to people at town meetings saying, let's wait for the Supreme Judicial Court to rule, we wouldn't have this problem. Because their whole idea was to stick with the party line, if you want to say that, right? They can't admit or critically think beyond, why didn't we wait?
Absolutely. And let's see what each and every select board member said. Now, I've edited these down for time.
Yeah.
Right? There was longer speeches, but obviously, in the essence of time, I've cut these all down. So each and every select board member, we're going to listen to what their selection was, because they had to vote. So that was just his recommendation. The select board itself actually had to go through and make a selection. So let's go back and look here. The first one will be Teresa Flynn, what she had to say.
I haven't addressed publicly my reaction to this referendum. I don't know that I necessarily have much in terms of reaction. I'm not surprised. I agree with the town manager's recommendation for scenario B. I do want to see us have clarity around our compliance sooner than later. The difference between January 28th and February 4th, again, I think the deciding factor there for me would be the convenience for voters in the schools.
Compliance. Now, the last part, because it comes up again, I just want to be clear here. Convenience in the schools. One of the comments around it was, well, those are half days. You want to guess? One question. You know what day is not a half day for school?
February 4th?
No, it is.
Oh, okay.
May 6th, the standard election.
Which is funny.
So which we have every year, right? So every year, election day, it's such a big deal that we have a half day so that the schools are not in session from 2 to 6.
Yeah.
But except for
the massive election that we have.
The yearly election of town, right?
Yeah.
That one, not a problem.
That's funny.
That's
I did not
fine.
know that.
Yeah. So that's what I just got to throw that out there. So when you hear that comment, I would say, well, if it's that big of a deal, why don't you look at when we hold our town election then?
Yeah.
Give me a break. All right, next one. We have Mr. Garcia.
As I've stated several times, I believe that compliance is the best path forward for Shrewsbury. While I am disappointed that Shrewsbury will enter into the new year as a non-compliant community, I firmly believe that our residents will see that there is value in being in compliance when they head to the polls. Right now, we are in this situation because enough community members have come together and have petitioned us to examine this further and bring this up to a townwide vote. I also want to be mindful that with the polls only being open for such a limited time, that the March date will lend itself to more folks being able to get involved with the process. I, of course, am concerned with the ramifications of noncompliance, what the ramifications of noncompliance are for our community. I also hear the concerns of the many who have signed the petition who have asked us to wait until there is a decision in the Milton case. I think that by moving forward with a March date, we can build trust with the community and also allow residents clarity with whatever the outcome of that case may be.
Well, I'm glad he actually asked for March, but unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to have that much more clarity, even though we have an outcome of the case.
Yeah, exactly. And give him credit, he did bring up a couple of points that I think were worthwhile. Enough people in the community had concerns, and they're legitimate concerns, and we should give them time to think about this, right? I can disagree with Mr. Garcia on a million issues, but on this particular instance, he's actually right? He might have ulterior motives, he might have anything else, but the point is he saw that 1,800 people voted or signed a document saying, you know what, I don't think this is very right. And he's willing to admit that, and he's willing to say we should give them more time. Yeah,
at least 4 weeks. And at least, hey, okay, not February, we won't wait till May, that's too late. But yeah, that's a compromise date.
Yeah.
That March date was fair. And I agree with you. I do think he at least said, you know what, I respect the other side, and I think it's important. And I think it was one interesting thing looking back at it. He said, the value of being in compliance when I went to the polls. And it's kind of like, well, what does that mean now? Because we may go to the polls and not really know what that means.
You're actually wrong right now because there is no compliance, right?
Exactly.
And I do think, you know, I know we're going through the rest of the folks
Yeah.
that spoke. Nobody else brought up the fact that maybe we should listen to these folks that actually had concerns. He was the only one.
Yep. You're correct. Yeah. On to Michelle Conlon.
I agree with my colleague and regarding the March date. I think that having the clarity of the SJC decision regarding the Milton case, which is different, it does not mean that everything that is decided there will apply to Shrewsbury. But I think having some clarity on that will help voters make a fully educated decision at the ballot. I think it's really important that we have hold this election on a day that is an early release day for the schools. So the January date for me is definitely not something I would consider. Just having the general public have access to our school buildings in order to vote.
I'm sorry. She's concerned about the general public having access to the school buildings when they vote, like they do every year on May. Like I'm confused.
The other issue I have there, and she's not the only one to bring this up, is the Milton case doesn't completely impact Shrewsbury. It absolutely does, right? As a matter of fact, to the point where in this particular, ruling, they throw out everything that had to do specifically with Milton, because it really came down to, we believe that the law is constitutional, but all of these guidelines was impact every single town need to be tossed and redone, right? And then they said the other issues are actually moot.
Yeah, and I was going to make a comment on that. That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought it up. I would agree. The frustrating thing is that I think a lot of elected people, they rely on information from others and they take it at such face value. I don't see people doing a lot of deep diving or even having like, hey, you know what doesn't make sense? I should look at that.
Yeah.
And I think there is that whole concept of somebody said that. And I can't remember who else did it. It might have been at town meeting. And I think she's picked up on it, where it might have been even Mr. Samia, where it's like, oh, well, they're talking about whether or not because of the Mattapan trolley, if they're a rapid transit community. I mean, that was such a minor piece of the case, right. To your point. 100% that the whole guidelines getting thrown out applies to everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Every single person. So yes, the outcome of the case was very impactful to Shrewsbury, and we're still trying to figure out what that really means, but a big impact. All right, we want to move along here to Beth Cassavant and how she decided to vote here.
I want to recognize that I think regardless of the date that's selected, there will always be people who wish we selected a different date. I also want to recognize that there are people in the room this evening who, were the petitioners, and that you hustled to get your signatures and you feel passionately about it and you engage in the democratic process, and I think that should be recognized. The grants are important, right? Residents are important, yes, 100%. Residents are important, but so are the grants, and I think the grants are important to residents in ways that maybe aren't immediately apparent. So my vote, that's a long way of saying, is February 4th, and I would like to have the community have an opportunity to have their say on this in a way that I think is both timely but does get pretty close to the February 14th SJC deadline.
The one question I do have is, I would love to know what the ways that aren't apparent of how these grants are impactful to residents. They couldn't really name them really right up the top of her head there.
They're
Not
hidden.
really sure. They're hidden.
You're not supposed to know.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
don't you know it's just good for you?
Yeah. And yes, residents are important, but grants were mentioned first. I always look at grants are important. Oh, wait, residents, but grants are important.
No, I laugh because I was at that meeting, and Beth said that's a long way. I aged 22 years during her very long presentation in that. She did go on, and most of it was really about compliance, and it was about grants, and it was not about the residents, right? Yeah. It was sort of a nod. You've worked really hard, but we're doing our best to ignore you. We'll do it with a smile, though, and that's something.
Yeah. So lastly will be the chairperson here, John Samia. So let's take a listen.
It's been well debated. However, I also respect the rights of residents to go with this process. And to me, it's a balance. I believe compliance is very important, and I'm not as wedded. And I went back and forth, and originally I was thinking March. But if my main crux is certainty. I'm worried about the impact of grants for 2025. If we're going to March, we may not be part of that cycle. We may. I don't think the SJC's decision completely helps us. We still will be non-compliant under 3A. We still will not be able to certify. And whether or not the guidelines and the date of non-compliance, we still won't be compliant. The SJC, that did come up, but town meeting still proceeded overwhelmingly, almost 2.5 to 1, to approve it. So I am at February 4th and scenario B.
So 3-2 vote, of course. So we can't make it look like it's 5-0.
Right.
So we'll talk ahead of time and say, well, you guys pick March, because it won't look like, it'll look in the middle. And we'll pick February. But that's the way we're going to go. Everybody agree? Yeah, break. Yeah. And we're going to come back. One thing I want to talk about, then I want make a comment. I want you to talk about because I think he was incorrect about that we'll still be out of compliance even if the guidelines are thrown out. But I think the comment I want to make here is, and I thought about this more, Mr. Sammy is an attorney and he is the chairperson of the select board, and I think he sets a group mindset. And the mindset is, and I think about, it's hard to split what you do professionally and I think your personal mindset. It's a little bit difficult. As a corporate general counsel, I think your number one mission is risk mitigation. Risk of the corporation, how do I mitigate risk, mitigate risk, mitigate risk? And that comes across very, very clearly in how he responded and how the whole entire board did. And I think that's a mindset that I don't 100% agree with. I don't think it's a very leadership mindset. I think it's a fear-based approach where we're saying, hey, the easiest, the best way to mitigate risk for the community, the easiest path will be for us just to go along. The harder part, I think, is to show true leadership and push back and say, I think there's a different way. I think
the answer could have been, that was an AI answer, right? We could just we could have a screen there with ChatGPT, right? The reality is that was the answer. And I think you're right. I think it comes from a mindset, from a professional aspect, right? What I want to see is vociferous debate, and I want to see people that are actually very passionate about how does something impact the community and the residents in the community. And I want a little less kind of AI response, just sort of, easy response, because that's the way I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, ultimately, I'm not surprised with the decision. I mean, I was kind of saying, hey, I think May was probably the best, but, I'm not that optimistic to think they would ever pick that. I was even hoping for maybe a March date, but hey, we're at February. We're still at February 4th, and we're going to talk more about that. The one thing I do want to comment is the next clip I want to show here is there was a lot of back and forth on Facebook and the social media about the date that they chose and things like that. And, I think there were some comments about that it was obviously done, at least the thought process was, to given the best opportunity to defeat the no vote, to make sure this thing went through.
Right.
And there was a comment by Teresa Flynn I just want to show here on her response to that tenor, I guess, around the community. Mm-hmm.
To every resident, we hope you go out and vote. Anyone who says that we are trying to rush this so we don't generate voter turnout, that is not my position at all. And I just would encourage people to find their source of truth and, determine who they trust to give them accurate information. And that might be one of us. It might be someone who is an opponent, or maybe someone in the middle.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will say this to the audience out there. As opponents, we'd be happy to be your source of truth.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for one, feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
Reach out.
I disagree with her. Yeah. It was rushed.
Yes.
It was purposefully rushed. I don't believe you, and you are not my source of truth. End of story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to fall back on that too.
It's laughable.
And I know that's I get it in their position, I suppose, that you spend a lot of time looking at things, you believe that you probably have more answers than most, but that's your first inclining to say, well, if you really want to know more about this, and just come talk to us.
Yeah.
Come find us. So I kind of agree. But the last thing I want to show here is, because we talk about, well, how could it really be different? We know how our select board behaves. We know how they debate, quote unquote debate, and how that they interact with each other. So I wanted to bring an example. This is about MBTA. This is actually Framingham. Now, Framingham is a city council, but if you look at it, they have councilmen. They have, I think, 11 districts. I might be wrong on the number, but let's listen to how they debate and how they talk and interact, because it's a little bit more freeform, shall I say, but I actually find it a lot more authentic.
Yep.
So let's take a listen to how they talked about, they were debating, should they table discussion on MBTA until February? This was, they needed to be compliant, and they were deciding, hey, do we even vote on this or do we wait? And let's listen to what they actually said.
I think there's a good chance that the SJC decision would be somewhere in the March range at the latest, and that's why I suggested that be the case. It gives everybody a chance to step back. We're not too far down the road. We have more information, and then we can maybe, in the interim, find other ways to look at this situation.
But Milton stood up, right? And they showed a backbone, right? And we didn't help at all with that. And now we're going to wait to see when the court what happens with them to decide whether we're going to go scurry and hide or whether we're going to stand up. I don't agree with that. That's how I feel about it.
I would also underscore the fact that the city solicitor referenced guidelines. Guidelines are not codified law. This December 31st thing is in guidelines, as is most of the requirements, as are most of the requirements. That is not the Code of Massachusetts regulations, and that's the important meat of the Milton case. It is unwise for us to start making lifelong decisions, because once we adopt the zoning, people are going to take advantage of it, and the cat's out of the bag.
All those in favor of tabling to February 4th, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Abstain. 6, 4, 1. February 4th. Happy holidays, everybody.
There you go.
Wow. That's what leadership looks like.
They tabled it. And actually, I don't know that last councilman, but he's done some homework.
Did a lot of homework. He understood the APA. He understood what guidelines meant. I want to juxtapose that with, and keep in mind, I believe the city council of Framingham is paid.
Okay.
Right. So they get money. So maybe there's a little bit more, but none of them are full-timers. Okay. Right. It's still a part-time, thing, but they put their effort into thinking about the community, and they actually ask tough questions. I have never heard one tough question about this act from anybody on our select board or our town bureaucrats or our, appointed officials. Not one. They all don't debate, and they all just agree on everything.
And they defer the question back to asking those who they believe should be the most knowledgeable, whether it was Mr. McGoldrick as, the planning and, because he was responsible for putting together the zoning and the planning board. But yeah, to your point, I've never said, based off my research, I think you're wrong.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever heard, I think you're wrong in a meeting.
No. And you go back to, Mr. McGoldrick's a good example, right? Magic spreadsheet. This is going to pass muster at the state. I bring up, you bring up, a number of citizens bring up, no, it won't. It doesn't. There's no mea culpa, by the way, right? The guidelines are going to be overturned in the Supreme Judicial Court. We should wait until the decision. Yeah. No. Let's talk about compliance. Right now, Shrewsbury is completely compliant because compliance technically doesn't exist. Right? So all along, when I say we as a group of citizens, have been right on all of this. The select board and the bureaucrats have been wrong on almost everything they've said. So why don't we have people that are willing to stand up for the residents? I know they were voted in, and I guess, and elections have consequences. So, this is the type of thing I think we need to see. We need to see more participation from people willing to stand up and be contrarians and ask the tough questions.
Absolutely. So we're out of time for this episode, but we have a lot more to talk about on this referendum, what the implications are, what is the governor's decision, what are the emergency provisions going to be. There's a lot we don't know. So I hope you come back and watch us in the next episode. But until then, I'm Greg Richards.
And I'm Brian Costello.
And we are the Unselects.